Adrian Kuah from the Kuan School of Public Policy is up next, and he's going to reflect a little bit on conceptions of time in East and West, and how those play out in different, interesting, innovative ways here in Singapore, where we both deal with very, very fast time and slow time at different moments. So, Adrian.
Right, good morning. Thanks, Aaron, for that introduction. Part of me wants to say that Vernie said everything I wanted to say, so we can really just skip to tea, but as it turns out, I still have quite a few things I want to share with you. What I'd like to do today is share with you some of my thoughts on this issue of time and society. I work in this area, somewhat esoteric area called future studies, and as the name suggests, time takes center stage. The future takes center stage. So when I talk about time today, I'm talking about time in terms of experienced time or perceived time. So my point of departure is that of the social sciences. So for example, when I talk about the slowing of time, I'm not trying to explain it in terms of relativistic physics. I'm talking about how you experience the slowing of time, as when a speech is really boring, as you will soon find out. Now, let me begin with the theme of this conference, which is East of West and West of East. And the thing is that you cannot utter this couplet without thinking of Kipling's The Ballad of East and West. Right? If you recall the ballad, it's essentially a contestation of ideas, of concepts, of values, and also partly a partial reconciliation or even partial acceptance between the so-called East and West that he talks about. And many of these contestations of ideals find very obvious and compelling expressions in Singapore. Right? Singapore always mentioned as being a hub in the global network of global cities, being at the crossroads. And you start to see many of these tensions and conflicts play out. Now, typically a very simple or even crude reading of this juxtaposition of East and West is framed in terms of the modern versus the traditional or even the primitive. And you see this play out also in many different aspects of the human condition, such as in the economy, in terms of our attitudes towards technology adoption, in terms of values, whether they are progressive and liberal on the one hand or conservative and traditional on the other. And if you look about you and friends who have just come in from overseas, when you look at Singapore in the physical sense, you can see in Singapore the contrasts and the fusions of the so-called traditional East and the modern West, in its skyline, in its architecture, in its assignment of space and meaning. And when these things are well synthesized, what you get is this continually emerging third culture. But when done poorly, what you end up with is mockery and caricature, and this very uneasy bilocation of the sacred and profane. So in my view, even where you have all these different conflicts and contestations playing out, I think that the East-West dyad most fruitfully reveals itself in terms of time and the rhythms of life. And I think a society's most fundamental relationship is with time. And we see this reflected in the ways we talk about time. So I did this last night with my 12-year-old son, just to see how many phrases we could come up with that use time. And these phrases are uttered in societies across the world. And in Singapore, some of them are used more often than others. We're always enjoined to don't waste time, right? We borrow things from the sports vernacular. Time out, which is very much a sports term, is now a very common parenting term. Instead of spanking the child, you put the offender in the corner and say, that's time out. And also, as a nod towards Singlish in Singapore, the second but last, where got time, is this phrase we use, all the time when we don't want to do something, and we just tell our bosses or superiors, hey, where got time? I've got no time for this. So, time is woven into almost every aspect of our human condition, whether it's in work, in family time, in the social, in the economic. But what I want to say is, perhaps in Singapore, you have one dominant discourse of time, So what I want to do is share with you this quote from this somewhat obscure book that I love. It's called Stargazing, Memoirs of a Young Lighthouse Keeper, written by this person, Peter Hill, who at one time took on the job of a lighthouse keeper of Scotland. And he says this, and I'm just going to read this out. Try staying awake until 3 in the morning, and you will soon find you are so tired you can hardly think. Then stare at the sky and contemplate the vastness of the universe. Gradually, you will turn into a lighthouse keeper. But take your time, for time is precious. There's no hurry. There never is on the lighthouse. And when I first came across that phrase, I was initially very bemused. But as I thought more about it, it really shook me to the core, because it never occurred to me that this other worldview was plausible, much less possible. Right? And the reason is that in Singapore, we typically flip it around. We don't normally say, take your time, for time is precious. We say, don't waste time, for time is precious. And so we're continually enjoying to squeeze even more out of a sliver of time. And Singapore certainly is a place in a hurry. If you look at Singapore's economic success story, such as it is, it can actually be explained in terms of what David Harvey, the postmodern theorist, talked about in terms of the annihilation of space by time, right? By Singapore's ability to accelerate, to pull away from the pack, the conquest of space, which is manifested in phrases like climbing up the value chain, breaking new ground. So what we have here is, was it something I did? So if you looked at the wealth of nations in terms of the Olympic Games, right, we could never always check the box on stronger and higher, but we could always count on being faster in terms of efficiency, faster in terms of getting to a consensus, faster in terms of reflexes. And while other places tended to use the phrase go big or go home, what we have here in Singapore is, to use a Hokkien phrase, "ai pia jia e yang," which translated means, if you want to win, hurry up, be faster than everyone else. But what happens now when sheer speed no longer suffices? And not only that, when sheer speed starts to take a toll on society, in terms of fatigue at best, and neurosis at worst. And you start to see this pushback, right? It takes the form of a nostalgia for the so-called kampong spirit, right? Where presumably the pace of life was slower and more enjoyable. And when you think of the many challenges that we now face, many of it is framed in terms of the conquest of time. We see this in the education system, where we privilege getting results fast, where, interestingly, par for the course, right? The mainstream that most kids get into is actually termed the express stream. And the primary economic challenge of our times is actually framed in terms of productivity, which is about getting more done with less in given time. And look all around here, and you start to see incubators start to sprout up everywhere. And what do incubators do other than to accelerate growth? So, beyond all of these interesting contemporary challenges, if I were to use Manuel Castell's concept of the space of flows as opposed to the space of places, it also opens up another dimension by which to appreciate Singapore. Now, again, the usual analysis frames Singapore as simultaneously and very often problematically as a nation-state and a global city. When you overlay the concept of the space of places and the space of flows on this analysis, what are the implications for notions such as identity, right? Especially when identity is typically tied to place, and global cities suggest transient and ephemeral flows of ideas, of concepts, of people, goods, capital, and so forth. So, coming back to this point of taking your time, I think you're starting to see some resistance to this exhortation to hurry up. Right? And this raises questions of meaning that our slivers of time are imbued with. So you start to see a proliferation of different temporal logics. where just being fast isn't the be-all and end-all. So let me just share with you some ways in which we might consider lives and times in Singapore. And this also calls into question where the very maxim we live by, right, be faster, may not suffice, right? Because what happens when other people are almost as fast as you? And the name of the game isn't the annihilation of space by time, but the annihilation of time by time. Who's faster? My time beats your time. So in terms of how we frame time, let me suggest that maybe we can go away from tempo, right? Where tempo is typically understood as how fast a thing is. What about other aspects of time in our lives? What about periodicity? How often a thing happens? And this really forces you to locate life experiences in the longer durée. It takes into account generational time, times of families, times of tribes, times of culture. We talk about timing as well, where a thing needs to synchronize with other things. And talk to any working adult with a child, and you start to see how this thing plays out, where you need to manage work time, family time, the schedules of your children, and how everything needs to synchronize in order that they don't fall apart. When you talk about time, you can also ask how long a thing lasts, right? And in a throwaway society where we're very quick to dispose of things, to buy new things, how long a thing lasts has perhaps been underprivileged as opposed to novelty and newness. Similarly, we talk about sequence. When things speed up to such an extent, does sequence still matter? If you look at the so-called story of success, if you look at the time of my father's generation, there was a very well mapped out sequence of things that needed to happen. You go to school, you graduate, you get a job, you meet someone, you fall in love, you stabilize your income, and so on and so forth. What happens when this sequence gets disordered? What happens when all these things occur simultaneously? And the last also speaks to the complexity that we're starting to see in society, density. How many things are going on at the time? So many things going on that you're just flummoxed and just unable to focus on any single thing. So I just want to share with you this there's different ways in which you might try to understand the times and the rhythm of our lives. So let me just conclude by drawing on the work of two theorists that I really like. Manuel Castells, whom I've already mentioned, where he also talked about instantaneous time and a timeless time that characterizes the network society. If you take that argument to its logical limit, right, then you might say that we're living in an extended eternal present. And if that's the case, if things are moving so fast that all we're left to do is to simply react, then, to borrow from Nicholas Lerman, we might ask, can the future actually begin? So with that, I just want to share with you some of my thoughts on this, and I look forward to your comments and feedback. Thank you very much.